Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Joe Kozlowitz. I'm on the marketing team here at Lunavi. I'm just going to do a little bit of brief kind of housekeeping before I hand things off to our presenter. So firstly, I want to let you know that we are recording this session. So if you need to jump off at any time, I will be sending out the recording link to all registrants. Secondly, although there is a presentation component, please don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't worry about pulling us off track. Aman is here as a resource for you to learn from. So use the raise hand feature in Teams or just jump in the chat to get our attention. I will be monitoring in the background, and we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can just go ahead and pop them in chat or save them for the end. Quick overview of Lunavi for those of you who have not worked with us before. We provide digital transformation consulting, cloud solutions, custom application development, and managed IT services. So we are really a partner that can take you all the way from traditional co-location and your on-prem data centers to fully modernized cloud-native apps. We are a Microsoft Gold partner and one of just a handful of Azure expert MSPs, so we are intimately familiar with the Microsoft ecosystem. Our goal is to provide a long-term partnership that helps you deliver real business value from your technology. So from automating or providing managed services for routine IT tasks to actually implementing agile processes within your org, we help you navigate what's next. Before I introduce our presenter, I also wanted to remind you that we have 4 more Azure Skill Up sessions upcoming. So join us every Thursday through early September at this time to learn something new. You can register at this link on your screen. I'll also drop that in the chat momentarily and include it in my follow-up email. So we have sessions upcoming on automation with Azure Bicep, networking, talking about service endpoints and private endpoints, cloud security with Azure Security Center, and then Azure architecture using design patterns. Today's presenter is Aman Sharma. He's one of our principal consultants and a former employee of Microsoft. Loads of experience working in the cloud, specifically within Azure. So it's a great resource for you if you have questions before or after any of our remaining sessions. You can always reach out to him. I have added here his Twitter handle and blog, and as well as his YouTube, so you can find him there, or you can reach out to myself directly or Aman for his contact information. So without any further ado from me, I'll hand things off to Aman to get things rolling.
Thanks a lot, Joe. I'll take over the presentation. Let me know if you can see the screen.
We can see it.
Perfect. So we'll kick off the presentation aspect of this session. I'll try to keep the session less on the presentation aspect, but more on the demo aspect. Anybody, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat window. I'll try to address as many as we can in our Q&A section towards the end. We'll look at why we are discussing today's topic. We'll look at the Azure Backup Service. We'll look at the Azure Site Recovery Service, and then we'll look at what could be your migration strategy if you are coming from on-premises into the cloud, leveraging Azure Site Recovery, and then followed up by a Q&A session. So to understand why we are discussing all these topics related to Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery, we need to understand what is the impact of data loss. Data protection is one of the most critical aspects in today's business. With ransomware attacks on the rise, Reuters reported that up to 1,500 businesses were affected by ransomware attack. Business Standard, they reported that data breach, it costed world's top brands up to 223 billion. And from the job perspective, how it impacts you specifically for infrastructure admin, for infrastructure architects, for domain architects. There are so many jobs available in the market right now that focus on this aspect. They have this as a required skill these days. We begin today's session keeping all that in mind, keeping how important our data is with the concept of Azure Backup. We'll go over a couple of slides to understand what Azure Backup is, and then we'll jump into the Azure portal to see how we work with Azure Backup. Azure Backup is a single solution which spans across your environment. Azure Backup, it not only helps you back up your Azure resources, but it also helps you back up your on-prem resources. And it's not just VMs anymore. There are so many different types of data that you can back up. You can back up your files. You can back up your SQL Server if it's on a VM. You can back up SAP HANA on a VM, and many more data types. How does the backup process look like behind the scene? How does it work? What is the basic architecture of the backup? Azure Backup is a service. It is a PaaS service provided out of the box by Microsoft. You do not need to configure any binaries for this service. What happens is there is a backup extension which gets installed via the VM agent on Azure virtual machine. And then through that, snapshots are taken and differential backup is taken for your data disks and your OS disk. And then those snapshots of your VM, those are transferred into the backup vault. Backup vault behind the scene leverages a storage account, which has different mechanisms, that is GRS, LRS, RAGRS, which we'll see during our demo aspect of this particular session. From compliance perspective, the backup service and along with this, even the site recovery service, it adheres to so many different compliance certifications. There few are on the screen like HIPAA compliance for healthcare, GDPR for privacy, ISO compliance, CSA compliance, etc. Complete list can be found on this particular link. So you can rest assured when you leverage this service, the backups that you will take, the process that you will formulate around your protection of your data will be compliant to whatever standard your organization is going to adhere to. Now, when you create a backup service, you want to control access to this backup service. If there is an attack, if you want to protect your data, at the same time, you also want to protect the backup of that data. That's why we need to understand how we can maintain the access control. If somebody gets access to the vault for HR department, they definitely should not get access to the finance vault. Otherwise, they will be able to spin up VMs for the backup data in the finance vault. So you want something called role-based access control. There are different levels of role-based access control, and you don't need to do anything. These roles specific to Azure Backup Service are provided out of the box to you. Some of these roles are backup reader, backup operator, backup contributor. Backup reader can view the data, but there is not much that they can do. Backup operator, they can enable the backup and restore the backup. Backup contributor, they can do even much more. They can perform policy management. They can delete or stop the backup. You can even create a custom role based on this out-of-box roles, combining whatever aspects, whatever operations you want the end user to perform. Now, let's look at this backup. How secure is this backup? You want to ensure that the backup itself is also secure. We talked about access to the backup security over there, but the backup itself is secured by different mechanisms. The first one is that you protect it using a security pin for multiple layers of authentication. If you enable multiple factor authentication on the backup itself, then you need something called security pin to access the backup. It has support for Azure Disk Encryption. You can configure your custom encryption keys that you can leverage to encrypt the VMs first, and then that you can leverage to take the backup of those VMs. You have hybrid backup encryption and storage side encryption enabled and available in the backups. RBAC for restricted access, that is role-based access control, which we saw in the previous slide. And then if anything goes missing or any action occurs, positive or negative, you can have alerts. You can take action based on those alerts for your backup. You can even have email notifications for some things like a job completion, restore occurring from a backup. You can have email notification going to a DL or individual system administrators. And then when you recover the data, there are enhanced steps to even further provide security. For example, accidental deletion. If somebody deletes your data, your backup data, then you don't have access to the backup data. If somebody gains access to your backup vault and does that, you don't have access to the data. But there is something called soft delete. If you enable the soft delete, which is enabled by default on a backup vault, then the data will be stored for additional 14 days. Even if you delete the restore points, those restore points which were there will be stored additionally for 14 days. You can recover using, sorry, let me go back. You can recover using alternate server in case original server is unavailable. So you have multiple recovery options, which we'll see when we'll go into the demo section. From monitoring aspect, you have multiple options. There is inbuilt monitoring that we'll see during the demos. You have log analytics or Azure Monitor, where you can configure additional and enhanced alerts on the backup jobs, on the backup, any alerts that gets created by somebody taking action on the backup. And there is a feature called backup reports. This is how it looks like. And you have multiple different tabs up here, but it gives you enhanced view into the backup more than what is provided out of the box. There are additional steps to configure this backup reports, which are very easy and available in Microsoft documentation. We won't be going into the backup reports, but I just wanted to ensure that you are aware that this is something that is available for monitoring as a feature. That brings us to the first demo. We'll jump into the Azure portal and we'll start. To begin with, we need to have something called Recovery Services Vault. To do that, I need to navigate to Recovery Services Vault. I can do that by clicking on these three lines and clicking on All Services and then searching for Recovery Services Vault, or at the top in the search, which is my favorite place to search for and navigate to any different section. You can just start typing and it will appear up. Recovery Services Vault is something where Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup, both the services are clubbed. It is recommended to have a different Recovery Services Vault for all your backup requirements versus a different Recovery Services Vault for your ASR requirements. To create, simply click on this plus create button. And then in the creation wizard, all you need to do is provide a resource group. You can even create a new resource group. And then provide the vault name, provide a location where you want to deploy this vault. And then you provide the tags. And then you review everything. And once you are happy with the vault, hit create to create the vault. I won't be creating the vault because I already have a vault created, which is this one, Demo Backup US East. This is how the backup vault looks like. The inbuilt monitoring that we were talking about, one place that you will find it is right here on the overview screen. In here, where it says backup, it will show me the backup items. It will show me the monitoring. Anything is critical, any warning that I find. It will give me backup pre-check status, backup job status, all the things in one go. But if you don't understand any of the concepts in here, you don't need to worry. All we are looking here right now is that this is a vault, a place where backup is configured. The very first thing that you want to understand when you are in the backup vault is the sections related to the backup service. The first section is under getting started, which is like a wizard that walks you through step by step how you can configure backup on a virtual machine or any other instance, any other service. We'll look at the other options in a short while. Another section is if you have configured backup on something, then those backups will be available under protected items. These are the different backup types that we were talking about earlier. That is a virtual machine, Azure storage, that is Azure files on an Azure storage account, SAP HANA database on an Azure VM, SQL database on an Azure VM, DPM, your on-premises DPM, Azure Backup Server or Backup Agent if you have configured one in a hybrid environment. And then lastly, you have these backup policies where you can configure a backup policy for each and every one. We'll come back to the policies in a short while. Any job that you run for a backup, for example, if you configure a backup and you take the backup, then that will be visible under this monitoring section where you can have you can view alerts collectively. But the section we are interested in is the backup jobs. Any backups that were taken, if you have configured the backups to be taken every day, you can view the status whether the backup was completed successfully or if there was a failure or if there was an alert generator. This is where you will come to troubleshoot. View details will give you more details into what occurred during that particular job. Now to configure the backup, the very first item you want to configure is a backup policy. Backup policy dictates how frequently the backup will be taken and how often, for how long the backup will be retained. Let's create a quick policy for Azure virtual machines. As soon as I click on create, it gives me the option what kind of policy I'm creating. These policies will be available when I'm going to configure the backup for a particular VM or particular data type. For this demo, we'll select Azure Virtual Machine as the policy. We'll say the policy name as demo. We'll say daily 4 a.m. We'll update the time zone to wherever your customer is located, wherever you have all the VMs located, if those are in Azure, if those are on premises, wherever the on-prem location is. I'm located in Eastern time zone, so I'll select Eastern time zone. And I want to select a time which will be off hours so that least amount of people will be working, or ideally no one will be using this virtual machine. Instant restore is it leverages snapshots instead of a backup of the VM itself. And this is much faster when you are restoring the VM. Next up is retention. You can take backup at multiple different periods. You can take backup, for example, at a daily point, which is what we configured in the schedule up above. And then for how long that backup will be retained, that is taken every day at 4 a.m. I will configure that that backup should be retained for 30 days. If you want additional backups to be taken or additional retention policy, so for example, you can configure that backup, the daily backup that is taken on Sunday at 4 a.m. that should be retained in addition to the daily backup retention policy for 12 weeks. Similarly, you can configure retention for monthly backup and yearly backups. I will clarify in the policy as well. I like to provide names which can explain directly from the name itself how the backup policy has been configured. This will be dictated by the SLAs that your company wants to adhere to. Finally, once you have configured the policy, hit create to create this particular policy. It will take a couple of minutes before this deployment is complete. While this is happening, in fact, the deployment has completed. I can go back to my backup vault, which is the demo backup US East we begin with. Now that we have a policy which dictates how often the backup is taken, when the backup is taken, and for how long the backup will be kept, the next action left for backup is to take the actual backup or to configure the backup on a virtual machine. To do that, what you need to do is under the protected items, navigate to backup items. In here, because we are dealing with virtual machine today, we'll navigate to Azure Virtual Machines. Here, it will show us what virtual machines are available. It shows me that this dev VM 101 backup is configured. Last backup status is success. Backup pre-check is best. Test VM move 02, this the first VM. It shows that the backup pre-check succeeded, but it also shows that the backup has been disabled, and that's why it shows this red and cross sign in front of this VM. Why it still shows this item over here? Because I have something that we discussed earlier, soft delete enabled on this backup vault. Now to configure the backup for another VM, all you need to do is click on this plus add button. In here, it will give you this wizard with the heading as backup goal. It will ask you where your backup is located. You can select Azure, Azure Stack, or on-premises. Azure is the option where my virtual machine is located. If instead of virtual machine, you were selecting something else, that target you will select over here. I want to backup Azure virtual machine, then that is what I'll select here. Click backup. It will ask you to select the policy. And this is the policy that we created just now. So we'll leverage that particular policy. It will give me a snapshot of the policy, what will happen inside the policy, when the backup will be taken, for how long the instant recovery snapshot will be retained, and how long the daily backup will be retained. Now to add a virtual machine to this policy, click add. It will give me a list of all the VMs available in the subscription in this particular region. The VM has to exist in the same region where the backup vault is located. That is very critical for the whole backup configuration. So I'll select this dev VM 102, hit OK. It will validate whether the VM is in a condition that the backup can be configured on the VM. It selected that VM, it selected the resource group of the VM. And do you want to backup only the OS disk, or you want to select the complete VM along with its data disks? Leave the checkbox unchecked to include all the data disks. And then all that is left is to click enable backup. A job will be fired. It will say deployment in progress. And then the backup job will be created and the backup will be configured. We don't need to monitor this job, but if you need to monitor this particular deployment, once this deployment is done, we can do so by navigating to the backup vault, navigating to the monitoring section, and then checking the monitoring job. To do that, I can go back to the backup vault. This is the backup vault that we have been leveraging. Then navigate to the backup jobs. Once the deployment will be done, once it triggers the backup job, the configuration, we will see a job configured over here. In fact, I believe this is the job that we are interested in, the very first one, to configure the job. Behind the scene, it installs the agents. It does some configuration on the VM itself. So it requires the VM to be up and running for you to be able to configure the backup on the VM. The deployment has succeeded, and that's what we saw in the backup jobs as well. Now, soon enough, when the schedule will hit the first time, that's when the initial backup will be taken. That means tomorrow at 4 a.m. is when the initial backup will be taken. To validate that, if I navigate to protected items, the backup items, and then navigate to Azure Virtual Machines, I'll see dev VM 102 listed, but under the last backup status, it will show me that the initial backup is pending. I can click on this row to view the status. It says that there is no restore point available because we just configured the backup on this particular VM. After 4 a.m. tomorrow, as we configured in our policy, there will be the first backup that will be configured on this VM. Let's see how that backup will look like. If I navigate back and I go to the VM dev VM 101, for which there are multiple restore points available. Because the backup was configured a couple of days earlier on this VM, I see multiple crash consistent backups and one app consistent backup. If the VM is in shutdown state, then only crash consistent backups are configured. If the VM is up and running, then Azure Backup behind the scene leverages something called volume shadow copy, through which it takes application consistent backup, wherein Microsoft guarantees that the applications running on the VM at this point in time will also be running if you restore from this VM. If you have any questions regarding the backup section, feel free to post those in the chat section. This is all about how to take the backup, how to configure the backup. First, we configure the backup policy, and then we configure the backup on the VM, leveraging that particular policy. Now, another thing that we want to understand, let's say the disaster level event has occurred. So now what next? The disaster level event has occurred. Let's say somebody has attacked via installed ransomware. So we have 30 days worth of backup. So we know that the ransomware was installed sometime during last couple of weeks. So we want to go back more than last couple of weeks. So in an actual scenario, you will have a restore point from the last 30 days if you have configured the backup according to your policy. Maybe even longer if you have backup policy configured like that. So now to come out of the ransomware attack without paying any ransom, what you want to do is you want to recover your data. You have two options over here. If only few files were corrupted, then you can leverage file recovery option. Just click on file recovery option. It will give you a script. It will say download this executable and run it from a VM, and then it will mount the disks as a data disk connected to that particular VM from where you will run this executable, and then you will be able to recover the data on those disks. This option is recommended because it helps you to identify whether the data was good in that particular scenario from the recovery point that you have selected or not. You can select a different recovery point by just clicking on this drop down. Now, the other option that you have is instead of file recovery, you can recover the whole VM itself by clicking on this restore VM. So in here, you need to select the recovery point first. You can select the start and the end date if you are performing the backup for a longer duration of time. Once you do that, all the backups for that particular start and end date between those will be listed here. Let's say we select this particular restore point. As soon as I select, I'm given two options. I can either create a new VM, leveraging that restore point, or I can replace the existing VM. In most scenarios, you will replace the existing VM, but before doing that, you can always test by leveraging the option to create a new. You can provide a name for the new VM, a resource group, virtual network, subnet, and a staging location. Staging location is a storage account. Any dummy storage account will work in the same region as the VM and the backup vault. And then you hit restore, another VM will be created with the name that you specify. If you select replace existing and select a storage account as a staging location, then if you click restore, the existing VM will be deleted and recreated, leveraging the disks from this restore point. Now that's how you restore from your backup. Any questions over here? All right. One last option related to backup before we jump into the Azure Site Recovery section are the backup configurations. They are available under properties over here. One specific configuration that I want you to focus on is the backup configuration. Do you want to your backups to be available in a different region? And if yes, do you want to enable cross-region restore? That is, your primary region is not available. For some reason, you want to restore the backup in a secondary region. And the secondary region in this case will be the paired region. For example, for East US 2 location, that paired region is Central US. Microsoft has documentation around what is the paired region for each primary region. So if you select geo redundant and you enable cross-region restore, behind the scene, it leverages a storage account that has RAGRS enabled, that is read accessible globally redundant storage. To validate whether that is the case or not, you can navigate to the overview screen. And then for monitoring of the backup, you see the backup storage right here. You can see which kind of backup storage is being leveraged for your backup vault. It will be one of the first three options. By default, it will be LRS. The enhanced option, if you have globally redundant, will be GRS. If you have cross-region restore, that means when you are restoring the VM, you will be able to restore to the secondary region. Then in that case, you will have RAGRS enabled, as is the case on my screen. And the option that will be available, if I go back to protected items, I navigate to Azure Virtual Machines and then to the VM. We saw these two options, file recovery and restore VMs, but I have one additional option available here, which is restore to secondary region. This option has become available to me because I enabled cross-region restore from the property section. Now, leveraging this, I can even restore to the secondary region, which is the paired region for my primary region of the VM. Hopefully all the things made sense about the Azure backup service. Now we jump back to the slides. We'll come back to this backup vault when we'll talk about the Azure Site Recovery. Now, the primary thing you want to understand before we start talking about Azure Site Recovery, why do we need Azure Site Recovery? In case you have Azure backup configured, in case you have cross-region restore, you don't need Azure Site Recovery. So what is the use case? Two primary things. One, if the primary region itself goes down, you won't have access to your Azure backup vault. And second, the backup, as we saw, the fastest frequency for the backup is once per day. If you want something more than that, if you want the data to be backed up once every, let's say, 15 minutes, then you want an enhanced solution that can provide you that kind of frequency. And that enhanced solution is Azure Site Recovery. It provides you true disaster recovery or business continuity for your environment. If the primary region goes down, Azure Site Recovery ensures that your workloads will be available in the secondary region. This is also a built-in disaster recovery as a service. It's available right in the backup vault that we were working with just now. As I said earlier, it's recommended to use a different recovery services vault for backup requirements and a different one for ASR, that is Azure Site Recovery requirements. It keeps your business operational even during major IT outages. It is automated and provides faster recovery for your most critical systems. It has a higher price tag, so you want to ensure that you leverage this for your most critical systems. I believe the price tag is something like 25 USD per protected item, that is per VM. Now, when we talk about ASR, in any business continuity discussion that you will have internally, the terms RPO and RTO are integral. You will hear people at the C level, at the technical level, talking about the RPOs and RTOs. So let's take a quick minute to understand what RPOs and RTOs are. RPO, to understand that, let's assume that this is the point in time when your backup or retention was taken. And this is the time when the disaster level event occurred. It could be power failure, as simple as that, or it could be a tsunami, an earthquake, or an alien invasion. So your primary region is not available. You have the DR level event that occurred at that point in time. Now the RPO will be how much data will be lost. There would have been some more time that would have been required for the before the next backup, the time when the next backup would have been taken. But this was the time when the last backup was taken. So from this time to the time the disaster level event occurred, any changes that occur during this time will be lost. That is called recovery point objective. The next term is recovery time objective. Time objective is, let's say this is when the disaster level event occurred, and this is the amount of time that it took us to recover from the DR event. That time taken to recover from the DR level event is called recovery time objective. So to reiterate, recovery point objective is the data lost due to the DR event, and RTO is the recovery time objective, that is the time taken to recover from the event. That is, you execute the failover, you create the VMs in a secondary region, and then you are up and running and operational in the secondary region. How much time it took us to recover from that is your RTO. Now, how does it look like? When you are setting up ASR or Azure Site Recovery, or in general business continuity process, you define your RPOs and RTOs for different applications. You need to understand which application fits into which category in your environment. which application has a lower RPO versus which application is less critical and has a higher RPO. And then you document the DR failover triggers and approvals. What would constitute as a DR trigger, and if there are approvals required, what would constitute as approval in that particular scenario? Then you provide access control. You leverage built-in roles to ensure no unauthorized users trigger the failover. And then you create different recovery services vaults for different business units or tenants. And then you plan your DR site. ASR, it auto creates the DR region resources based on source configuration, including the virtual network and IPs. But you want to ensure that you control all this. You control the virtual network and the IP addressing on the DR site that is on the secondary region. The site connectivity needs to be planned and needs to be set up well in advance. The site connectivity should be there. For example, if you have connectivity to East US 2 region through express route, you need to ensure that if you are leveraging, for example, Central US as the secondary site, that you have some mechanism to connect to that site. It could be site-to-site VPN or another express route going through the Central US location. Then you monitor the replication health. You configure the replication for all the critical workloads, leveraging ASR, and then you monitor the replication health. You track configuration changes in the environment. And then periodically, ideally, you will do this once every quarter. You will test the DR process, leveraging DR drills. You will run test failovers to ensure that you can bring up the VMs in the secondary region or not. And ASR provides you with the capability to run the test DR without any impact on your environment. There are different strategies for that. You can leverage non-impacting versus impacting one as well if you are leveraging true virtual networks in your case. And then you can optimize the process further. We'll take a brief look at one of this aspect. But you can optimize leveraging automation. If there are multiple VMs that should be failed over together, then you can create something called recovery plans. Recovery plans, they group VMs and then they provide automation. After the failover, if you want to update the DNS automatically, you can have a script that will run through recovery plans that can do that for you. If you want additional items to be, additional steps to be taken, you can do those as well. In addition, you can leverage Azure policy to monitor and automatically apply recovery services to automatically configure replication on your critical VMs. Let's assume you apply a tag for criticality level on a VM. Then for most critical, whatever you define the VMs to be most critical, for those criticality levels, the replication can automatically be configured leveraging Azure policy. You can report on all the VMs. Across the subscriptions, across different resource groups. You can have pre and post scripts run for the failover, leveraging the automation we were talking about, that is your recovery plans. You have multiple different ways to automate everything. Even the triggering of the recovery plans, you can automate those, leveraging either REST API, CLI commandlets, or PowerShell commandlets. You can provide governance with the policy that we were just talking about. You can have two types of policy. One could be the audit policy that only tracks and provides you with the reports that, OK, you have X number of VMs out of, let's say, 100 VMs in your environment. There are 10 VMs that are marked as critical, but don't have replication enabled. You can go even one step further and have auto enable policy that will provide automatic configuration. The audit policy on the right hand side is the report, how it will look like. It will show you the compliance status, non-compliant, or whether the VMs are compliant or not. And then with the auto enable policy, you can even take action for those non-compliant VMs and enable the replication. Similar to Azure Backup, there are different monitoring available for Azure Site Recovery. There is inbuilt monitoring. You can leverage Log Analytics or Azure Monitor. You can have email alerting for your VMs. Recovery plan is an orchestrator approach to recovering from a DR event. You can define one-click recovery plan for applications. You can manage the boot order. For example, when an application that spans across multiple VMs is failed over to the secondary region, the database VMs will be brought up first, followed by the application VMs. That brings us to the second and the last demo of this session. We navigate back to the backup vault. In fact, we'll navigate to the recovery services vaults. Now the backup vault for ASR to be configured, the backup vault needs to be in a location that is not in the same location as the VM. So if I want to configure backup on my dev VM 01, which is in East US location, if I navigate to these VMs, this dev VM 101 and 102, all the VMs are in East US location. For me to be able to configure ASR on these VMs, the backup vault has to exist in a different location. So the first two backup vaults, they can't work because they are in East US location. And that's why I have third backup vault, which is in a different location that is not Central US location. When I navigate to this vault, the site recovery related or ASR related options are here. The monitoring is available in here under the overview page as a third tab, which will give you the replication health, failover health, configuration issues, etc. It will also give you a diagram of how the backup is working. We'll look at this diagram when we look at the individual VM. The getting started section, it explains the whole process, provides the documentation links as well. Protected items under this, the replicated items is where the ASR VMs will be. And then similar to backup policy, there is site recovery infrastructure. There is no site recovery policy, but there is site recovery infrastructure. Now let's see how we can configure replication on a VM. We can either go from here. We can select replicate, and then what do you want to replicate? You want VMware or physical machines from on-premises? You want Hyper-V VMs to Azure or Hyper-V VMs to a VMM, a System Center Virtual Machine Manager? In most of the cases, you will be protecting Azure Virtual Machines. So you can click on Azure Virtual Machines. It will bring up the wizard for enabling the replication for this VM. Now let's do something different. Instead of going from here, let's navigate to the VM and configure the replication from the VM. These options are now integrated for the backup and site recovery. These are integrated into the VM properties. So if I navigate to the VM under operations, you will see there is a backup option where I'll see the backup related information. We just configured backup on this particular VM. For disaster recovery, the options are here as well. And this is the VM on which the replication is already configured. So we'll navigate to the other VM, that is dev VM 101, for which the disaster recovery is not configured. That is ASR is not configured. To start the configuration, the wizard is a little bit different, but I assure you the settings are identical to what we saw or what we were going to see in the wizard from the recovery services vault. In here, you can select the target region. We can select any of the region, but let's select North Central US as that is closer to my primary region. Ideally, in a practical scenario, you would either want to use the paired region or you would want to use a region that is at least 500 miles away from your primary region. And once you have selected the region, it even shows you graphically where how the replication will work out. You will click on Advanced Settings. Now in here, you will select all the target settings. On the target side, which subscription will be leveraged? We are leveraging the same subscription. On the target side, is there an existing resource group that we want to leverage? Yes, we want to do that. And then is there an existing virtual network or you want to create a new VNet? We want this VNet to be available and set up beforehand and connectivity set up also beforehand. And then do you want any availability configured or any proximity placement groups configured? Under storage settings, you will configure a storage which will be cache storage. This storage will exist in the same region as the VM. The data will be copied from the VM onto this cache storage, and then it will be copied over onto the target region. Replication setting, you select the recovery services vault. We will select the one that is already existing for North Central US location. You select the replication policy. It's 24-hour retention by default. You select extension settings. Generally, for any updates, you will allow ASR to manage. You can also have the option to manually manage the updates for the replicated data. Finally, you will review all the settings and you will select Start Replication. Once you will click on Start Replication, it will create the target resources if ones are not created yet, and then it will enable the replication for you. Even if the backup vault was not there already, it can create the backup vault for you. Or more accurately, the recovery services vault for you. Now over here, in a short while, we'll see that this dev VM 101 is showing up here, and the status says that it is enabling protection. Again, it needs the VM to be up and running. If the VM is not up and running, it will not let you run the wizard. It will throw an error and will request you to start the VM. We'll see how it looks like for one of the existing VM. Sorry, before that, let's navigate to the monitoring section. There is a section for site recovery jobs. If I navigate to that, I'll see the job for ASR, that is for enabling of the replication. It's in progress right now. If I navigate to that, these are the steps, the underlying steps that it performs. It does a prereq check, it installs a mobility services agent, then it enables the replication. Once it has enabled the replication, it performs initial replication. Initial replication is a complete and full copy from the source VM to the destination. And then it updates the provider status. Once the initial full replication has been copied, once every 15 minutes, it copies over the delta. Whatever are the changes, every 15 minutes, it copies it over to the secondary region. Let's go back to the protected item. And let's look at the VM for which the protection is already enabled. So in here, the things that we want to see is health and status. The replication health should say healthy. There are two types of failover. At the top, you can see failover, which is what you will leverage in an actual failover scenario or in a true DR dry run. Test failover is what most people will use during the DR dry runs or DR drills. And test failover is what you will leverage to see whether you can bring up the VM in the secondary region or not. It shows the status whether you have successfully run a test failover or not. It says never performed successfully because that test failover has never been run. It even shows you the events that occurred in the last 72 hours here. And if there were some critical severity level alerts or events that occur. At the bottom, this is what we were talking about earlier. It shows you the split of the VM. It shows you graphically how that looks like, how the replication is working. In the East US location is where my VM is located. The cache storage account, as we discussed earlier, it also exists within the same location where the VM is located. The disks are copied, the OS and the data disks are copied from the virtual machine to the storage account before getting copied to the target region. Corresponding to each and every disk, there will be a managed disk created in the target region. This VM only had OS disk. That's why only one managed disk was created in the target region. On the right hand side, it even shows on the map that we saw earlier how the replication is taking place from which direction to which as well. You can even modify the properties, for example, the network selection. If you want to modify those, once the initial replication has taken place, after that, you can do that. You can see the different network interface, how it will look like in the source. What is it in the source region and how it will look like in the target region. The target network is selected to this one. If you want to edit this, click on the edit button at the top. Once it gives you the edit options, you can select the target network. You can update. Right now, I only have one VNet in the target region. If I had another, those will show up here. The network interface, if I click on edit, I can even go to the network level and can change the subnet if I had another subnets on that VNet. Any questions in this so far? Feel free to post the questions in the chat. And then under the disk section is where you will see all the disks, the OS disks and the data disks that are being replicated constantly. Now that wraps up the demo for Azure Site Recovery. And we'll jump back to the presentation. To sum up, we saw where the ASR sections are located, where are the protected items, how to view the monitoring data, how to configure the DR or replication on the VM. We saw two options of that from the vault and from the VM. We saw where the test failover and the failover options exist and where to monitor the jobs. Now, towards the migration strategy. As we saw during the demo that one of the options you had to perform the replication was from on-premises into Azure as well. That option you can leverage as a migration strategy. If you have a hybrid environment today and you migrate your workloads from on-premises into Azure, you can leverage ASR to do that. What that process will look like, you will perform initial assessment. You will set up the infrastructure whereby you will set up the ASR. There is a corresponding component. It's called config server that you will configure on premises. You will perform migration planning. There are some out of the box tools that you will leverage. But basically after that, you will enable the replication of on premises VMs into the cloud. And then using the failover option, you will perform actual migrations. Post-migration steps could be updating the DNS, updating the DHCP settings if required. Most of the time, Azure takes care of itself, but the configuration that I have seen after the ASR that you may need to do is configuring the IP address to be static if you have not done that during your planning session. You perform the initial assessment, you get some reports like this. The actual report will vary depending upon the tool that you used. This is a third-party tool that is being shown here. I think it's the I forgot the name of the tool, but it's a third-party tool that gives you detailed reports into how the initial assessment will look like. The migration infrastructure, you on premises, you create the config server, process server, master target server. There is not different setup for all these three servers. It's just one setup. You can split it into three different VMs if required, but mostly this is a VM on your VMware or Hyper-V. In Azure, you create a recovery services vault, you configure policies, etc. And then you perform migration planning, which VMs will be replicated first and then failed over first. You create Gantt charts around that, and then you actually replicate the data from on-premises into Azure. And then you perform actual migrations. This is a sample dashboard how when Lunavi does migrations, the kind of details that we give to our end users, how many VMs migrated, VMs decommissioned, because we find in many scenarios that the VMs were decommissioned, were no longer required, and there was no need to keep them on premises or in cloud as well. VM planned for next migration, on hold or require attention, and any config changes are required. We look at all those criteria. Post migration, we clean up the agents from the VMs. We configure backups on the VMs. We enable communication, any firewall rules required for the application to perform successfully, any additional setup, any monitoring log analytics setup, any DNS configuration, etc. For one of the customer, we saw they were leveraging a third-party DNS. So we required to do the configurations after the move. So we built a script around that that would automatically run as part of the recovery plan. That concludes whatever I had to present. These are some of the references from Microsoft documentation. If you are having any specific question, or if you are facing any specific thing that you need help with, feel free to shoot us an email or ask us. With that, I open the forum for Q&A. All right, I saw one question from Jeremy. The question is, in a migration, do we consider refactoring certain application versus just standard one-to-one VM migration? Absolutely. In many times we had to do that. Most of the migrations are lift and shift and then considering about refactoring the application. But in some scenarios, we saw that the application was so old, either we needed to upgrade the application or we wanted to refactor. We wanted to get rid of the older components and only take the components that we required into Azure. One of the opportunity that we see when migrating the workloads is leveraging the past options that are available in the cloud. For example, if the end user, they have a lot of SQL databases on premises, and if those are compatible with Azure SQL databases, we recommend to the customer to not migrate those VMs, but migrate only the databases to Azure SQL database as a service. So Chandrasekhar is asking what is the tool that's used for on premises migration to cloud. The tool is ASR, that is Azure Site Recovery that we saw. In the demo, we saw only VM, Azure VM to Azure migration. But if I switch back to the Site Recovery Vault and I select migration, you see here it says VMware or physical machine to Azure. If I navigate to this replication, it asks me to set up the infrastructure, prepare the infrastructure. If I do that by navigating to getting started, it says prepare your infrastructure over here. If let's say I'm migrating from VMware machines to Azure, I'll click on prepare infrastructure right here. It gives me the complete wizard. For example, it asks me whether I have done the planning. Planning is nothing but just looking at all the VMs, how much time it's going to take. There is an Excel sheet for that. And then this is where you will add a config server on premises. You will download a binary, which is an OVF template in case of VMware. You will import that into your VMware, and that VM will automatically have config server installed. And if you have connectivity that the internet connectivity from that VM, it will automatically report using an encrypted channel to this particular vault that this is the config server for your environment. Once you have this infrastructure configured, you can start replicating from on-premises from your VMware into Azure. And there are, if you can see, there are multiple options over here. VMware to Azure, Hyper-V to Azure, Hyper-V to another Hyper-V site, etc. Any other questions? Great questions, by the way. So there is no ISP provider between on-prem and cloud. When you will configure the config server, it leverages the encrypted channel over the internet to communicate with ASR. There is an option to leverage express route if you have that configured, but other than that, it is straightforward. You follow the wizard. It shows you how to configure config server on premises. Once that config server is configured, you will be able to replicate from on premises into Azure. The networking settings, you don't need to configure anything. They are in the same location that we saw earlier. That is under compute and networking. When you hit edit, you will see the networking settings from on-prem. You can't do anything about that, but you can control the networking settings in Azure. What will be the network in Azure, the target network, you will be able to select over here. That screen will look identical to the one you are seeing over here once you have replication from on-premises into Azure. All right, we are at the top of the hour. Great questions, and thanks for attending. Back to you, Joe.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the questions at the end there, too. And thank you, Aman. Really good stuff on today's presentation. As I mentioned, I'll send everyone a recording, so if you need to review anything that we covered today, you'll be able to peruse that at your leisure. And once again, I just want to remind you, for those of you who have not already signed up for any of the other future sessions, please go ahead and join us if you have interest in learning some more about Azure with Aman in the rest of the month. So thank you all. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, Friday, and the weekend is coming.